Thank you, everyone, for joining this morning. I'm going to guess that some of you have had some experience with a project that got into trouble. You may have read or been involved in presentations about troubled projects. So some of this may be a review. There might be some additional ideas that you'll get out of it. I think that sometimes a refresher in the things that we do as project managers really helps us to prevent projects from failing. So we'll talk a little bit about, the things that do actually cause projects to get into trouble and kind of face failure, and things that we can do to actually turn things around. So the objectives of the session goes, I want to basically establish this understanding of why it is so important and valuable to have a detailed project plan. And I want to qualify that by saying one other thing. It's very important for us to have a plan in place. And my mentor in project management always used to say, go slow now so you can go faster later. I mean, get things out on the table, plan things out so that you know exactly what you're going to get yourself into, and also establish a direction. The other thing that we have to remember is that we do need a plan to provide us with direction, but I also use a quote in just about any session that I've ever been in, including classes. It's a quote from Napoleon that basically states that the first casualty in any battle is the plan. So we do need a plan to get things started, but we have to be aware that as soon as we begin to implement the plan, things are going to change, and we have to be ready for change. So as much as we need a plan, we need to have continuous planning, and we have to have a focus on the excellence in the execution of that plan. So we'll also talk about methods to reduce the probability of project failure, and this has to do with some emphasis on risk management. One of the things that I've experienced in the last few years, especially, is the lack of attention to good, solid risk management in the form of simply asking things like, what-if questions. So we want to find ways to reduce probability by being ready and having Plan B and Plan C in place if necessary. There is a difference between leading and lagging performance indicators. I'll explain that in a little bit more detail later on. Those of you that are familiar with things like earned value might have an understanding of what a lagging indicator is. We will talk about some measures that will help us to determine the health of a project, and we'll also talk about some tools and techniques that may recover a project that's in trouble. So those are the basic objectives that we'll be going through during this presentation. Now, one of the things that we want to do here is actually kind of start off by, thinking about what are those things that are most uncomfortable for project managers to talk about, not just project managers, but also team members. There are discussions out there that project managers find extremely uncomfortable to engage in. Now, as we go through the presentation, feel free to send your comments. I'd like to use some of the comments from the people in the audience as part of the presentation, because we're talking about practitioners and things that you have experienced, and we find there's always an opportunity to add some of your knowledge into these types of presentations. But to talk about things that are somewhat uncomfortable. And the question is, what are they? Well, one of them happens to be the consequences of a failed project. And you have a couple of questions, and this is something that is not meant to create a negative feeling, and it's not being a naysayer or anything like that. But it's reality that not all projects are successful, and we have to start asking ourselves why, and also to understand the consequences of a project that has failed. So the question comes up, because my project failed, or the statement, because my project failed, my organization will. And how would you complete that sentence? Because my project failed, my organization will. And you have to kind of think about that, at least from the project team, the project manager, the project sponsor viewpoint, that my organization will what? Suffer recognition issues, reputation issues. My organization will experience a loss in revenue, a loss in business, or something like that. My project failed and resulted in loss of a key player, a key customer, some key team members that decided, well, I'm going to leave and find a place that's a winning team. the failure of my project team, the failure of my project caused my team to question my ability as a leader. The failure of my project caused my client to question my capability and reduce their confidence in me. The failure of my project caused potential clients to go to other clients, to go to other suppliers. So you really think about that. And I don't mean to bring these up as negatives, but we do have to think in terms of the consequences of when we have problems with projects. Okay, I see a quote coming from Kathleen. It says, in various other webinars I've attended over the years, speakers indicate that the majority of projects that fail is due to poor requirements. Well, I can tell you that from my personal experience and also looking at statistics, that poor requirements, or I should say the requirements issue, comes to the top of the list in many cases. But it's not necessarily just to poor requirements. It's the poor requirements management process. It's the how requirements are being gathered, how requirements are being prioritized, in addition to failure to actually state requirements clearly and specifically. So there are a number of things there that fall into the category of requirements, and it's not just poor requirements, but it's the whole process around it. Okay. What's the definition? Ricardo Vargas, who is a trainer, consultant, speaker in many different organizations and project management seminars, provided a definition. I modified it slightly, but basically a troubled project can be defined as a project where the difference between what is expected and what has been accomplished exceeds the acceptable tolerance limits, pushing into a situation and a course that could lead to complete failure. Now, one thing that I think we all have to keep in mind is that no matter how well you plan, no matter how much time and effort you put into it, that there is going to be variance. And what we have to do is we have to establish what is the acceptable variance or acceptable tolerance. And then we should have warning signs or indicators that help us to determine when we're starting to reach those outer boundaries of our tolerance levels. So kind of keep that in mind. But when we reach the point where we are no longer in an acceptable tolerance level, we're going to start to experience the elements of failure. I have a question from Hermant Patel. Is asking, in your experience, I'm going to say, do agile projects fail less often than traditional waterfall projects? I don't have a whole lot of information on the differences between agile failure and waterfall project failure. What I can tell you is that statistics as recently as the middle of this year from both PMI, the Project Management Institute, and PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and a few other organizations, including PMI's Pulse of the Profession, state pretty specifically that 44% of capital projects do not achieve their project objectives. And I think that we can relate that. If you look at the chaos report as put out by the Standish Group, that you will see that they study IT failure, and they have very, very high rates of failure in the IT world. As far as Agile goes, I think that the Agile approach, which is quite different than the approach, I think that they are seeing higher degrees of success because of the techniques that they're using and the quick response to change and so on. So I don't have actual figures that I can offer you. I'd certainly want to look those up. But I think that Agile, at least the people that I have spoken to that are using Agile, are seeing a greater success than what had been used in the waterfall type of arrangement in software development projects. If you think about the end results of a failed project, well, these are pretty obvious. The customer's needs are unmet, which can lead to some serious problems financially in terms of revenue, market share, and things like that. A failed project certainly causes stress for the project team, and they're kind of worried about their performance reviews and things like that. There's a negative impact on the business, not only in cash flow, but in brand